The Thursday after Carol's funeral, I made myself a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and did nothing for a long time. That was new for me. I had spent 41 years doing something, fixing wiring in houses I'd never live in, driving home with grease under my fingernails, watching the news Carol had already summarized for me before I'd even taken off my boots. She had a gift for that, condensing the world into what actually mattered. She could watch an hour of television and hand you the whole thing in 2 sentences without losing a word worth keeping. I sat at that table and thought about how quiet a house gets when the person who filled it is gone. Not silent. Exactly. The refrigerator still hummed. The oak tree outside still scraped its long fingers against the window when the wind came through. But underneath all that, there was a new kind of stillness I hadn't known before. The kind that settles in and tells you, without any cruelty, that everything has changed now. I was still sitting there when my son Derek called. He didn't ask how I was doing. He asked if I had found the will. I told him the lawyer would be handling that, same as I'd told him the day before and the day before that. He said he understood completely, and then he said he'd be coming by Saturday morning with Shannon. I said that was fine. I watched the oak tree move against the glass, and I thought about the envelope Carol had tucked into the back of her cedar chest 11 months before she died, the one she'd pressed into my hands on a Sunday afternoon when the light was coming through the bedroom curtains in that particular gold way it does in October in Tennessee. "Don't open this until you need to," she had said. I had asked her what that meant. She had smiled at me the way she used to smile when she'd already thought further ahead than I had, which was most of the time. "You'll know," she said. I drank my coffee and stared at the table, and I thought, I think I know now, Carol. My son Derek is 40 years old, and he has his mother's cheekbones and his grandfather's stubbornness and, I'd come to understand, a talent for arithmetic that only activates when the numbers belong to someone else. He had been a decent boy, growing up, quiet, serious, the kind of kid who made good grades because he understood that good grades were a doorway. What I hadn't understood until much later was that my son had spent his whole life looking for doorways, not for what was on the other side of them, but for the act of getting through. He liked to acquire things. He'd always been that way. I told myself for too many years that it was ambition. I understand now that ambition and appetite are different things, and only one of them has a limit. Shannon, his wife, was the kind of woman who brought a legal pad to family dinners. She laughed easily and touched your arm when she agreed with you. And she had been doing both of those things at my kitchen table for 11 years, and I had liked her for most of them. I started liking her less about 2 years back, when I noticed she had stopped asking Carol questions and started asking about the house, the square footage, what things had cost, whether we'd had the roof redone recently. Carol had noticed it before I did, which was typical. "She's been calculating," Carol told me one evening, standing at the sink. I told her she was being uncharitable. Carol handed me a dish to dry and said nothing else, which was how I knew she was certain. On Saturday morning, Derek and Shannon arrived at 9:30. Derek had a cup of gas station coffee he hadn't offered to bring me one of. Shannon had the legal pad. I made a pot of coffee anyway, and we sat in the living room and I listened to them explain that they were concerned about me. "They were concerned," Derek said, "because this house was a lot for one man to maintain." He gestured at the ceiling when he said this. "The house is 3 bedrooms, brick, sits on 1/3 of an acre in Gallatin, Tennessee, about 30 miles outside of Nashville. Carol and I bought it in 1987 for $89,000. I have not missed a mortgage payment in 37 years, and the mortgage has been paid off since 2009. The roof was replaced in 2021. I tended the yard myself, but Derek was gesturing at the ceiling like he was concerned about me. Shannon said that property values in the area had been climbing. She said this the way people say it when they mean something else. She had numbers written on the legal pad. I looked at them upside down, and I understood that she had been to a real estate website sometime recently. The numbers were higher than I had expected. I kept my face the way Carol had taught me to keep it when I wanted to think without being seen thinking. Derek said he and Shannon had been talking, and they felt it might make more sense for me to consider moving somewhere more manageable, an apartment maybe, or one of those communities designed for people my age, he said. where there were activities and someone to look in on you. He said this last part carefully, the way you say something carefully when you've practiced it. I asked him which communities he had in mind. He named one out near Hendersonville. Shannon had the brochure. I held it in my hands and looked at it, and thought about Carol's envelope, which I had opened 3 nights ago at the kitchen table, with a glass of bourbon and the oak tree outside, and the new kind of silence. The envelope had contained 3 things: a letter in Carol's handwriting, a key on a plain ring, and a smaller sealed envelope with a note on the outside that said, "Give this to Robert Whitfield, at Whitfield and Associates. He's expecting it." Robert Whitfield was our lawyer. I had called him the morning after I opened the envelope. He had said, with the steady voice of a man who had known Carol for 20 years, that yes, he was expecting my call. He said we should meet the following week. I had met with him on Thursday, 2 days before Derek and Shannon arrived with their legal pad and their brochure, and I had learned several things that Carol had not mentioned to me while she was alive. I held Shannon's brochure and thought about those things while Derek explained that the house would require upkeep I might not be up for, and that it was a significant asset that shouldn't sit idle, and I nodded in the way that I had learned from Carol, who had learned it from her own father, means absolutely nothing. After they left, I washed their coffee cups. I stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the backyard, at the garden Carol had kept along the back fence, dried out now and going to seed, and I let myself feel the specific sadness of a man who had just watched his son perform. My niece Rebecca called that evening. She's 34, lives up in Cookville, teaches elementary school, and is the kind of person who calls to ask how you're doing and means it. She and Carol had been close in the particular way that women in a family sometimes become close around a shared understanding. Rebecca had driven 4 hours to sit with me the week Carol went into the hospital for the last time, and she had stayed until after the funeral, sleeping on the guest room bed and making me eat breakfast every morning. I had not asked her to do any of this. She simply knew to come. I told her about Derek's visit. She was quiet for a moment on her end of the line. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I said I wasn't sure yet, which was mostly true. The following week, Derek called to ask if I had thought any more about the apartment idea. I said I had been thinking about it. He said good. I asked him what his timeline was, and there was a small pause before he said there was no rush. Of course, no rush at all. 2 weeks after that, he called to ask if I had spoken with the lawyer yet. I told him the estate was being handled properly. He said he understood, and then he asked whether the house would need to go through probate. And I said I'd let him know when I knew more. Shannon emailed me a link to a different senior community, this one closer to where they lived in Brentwood. The email said, "Harold, thought this might be more convenient. Let us know what you think." She used an exclamation point after every sentence. I read it at the kitchen table, and then I closed the laptop, and I went to sit on the back porch, and I watched the garden for a while. Carol had grown tomatoes, bell peppers, a row of zinnias along the left fence just because she liked them. She hadn't grown things because they were practical. She had grown things because she believed a yard should have some color in it. I thought about the second letter Robert Whitfield had given me at our Thursday meeting. Not Carol's handwritten one, I had read that one alone at home, but a document he had prepared at her instruction 14 months ago, when she had first been told that her heart was worse than any of us had understood. Carol had never been the kind of woman to leave things unfinished. The document established a trust. The property address on the trust was not our house in Gallatin. It was a different address, one in Watauga County, North Carolina, up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, near a small town called Valley Crucis. I had recognized the address immediately. I had driven past that property maybe a dozen times over the years, up on a high meadow road with a view of the mountains on 3 sides. I had said, every time, that it was beautiful country. Carol had agreed with me every time. She had been agreeing with me about it since she bought it 12 years ago. She had never mentioned buying it. Not once in 12 years. I sat with that for a long time in Robert Whitfield's office, and he gave me the space to sit with it, because he was a good lawyer and had known Carol long enough to understand that she did things for reasons. She had bought it through a separate account she maintained not hidden from me. Exactly. She had told me about the investment account years ago. I simply had not asked about it closely. She had grown it steadily, the way she grew everything, patient and consistent and without making a fuss. When the North Carolina property came available through an estate sale in 2013, she had bought it for cash. The trust held the property and the remaining account balance. The trust's beneficiary was me, with Rebecca named as successor beneficiary if I predeceased her. Derek was not mentioned in the trust document. The Gallatin house, our house, the one Derek had been calculating the value of at my kitchen table, was held jointly by Carol and me, and would pass to me outright upon her death, as jointly held property does. Derek had no claim to it. Shannon's legal pad numbers didn't mean anything except that she had found a website. Robert Whitfield had also given me a packet of information about Valley Crucis, North Carolina, that Carol had asked him to prepare. Local property tax rates. Names of reliable contractors. The number of a neighbor, a man named Gerald Holt, who had been keeping an eye on the property and was willing to continue doing so. A note in Carol's handwriting at the top of the packet said, "The garden up there will need work in the spring. I always thought you'd be good at gardening if you tried." I thought about that note on the back porch while the dried zinnia stalks moved in the November wind. Derek called on a Tuesday in the third week of November to tell me he had spoken to a real estate agent. He said this the way you say something you have decided to present as helpful. He said the agent had confirmed the property value was strong and that this was a good time to sell if we were going to sell. I asked him what he meant by we. There was the small pause again. He said he meant if I was going to sell, and that he and Shannon wanted to make sure I was getting good advice, and that they had also spoken to an attorney about what they called estate planning, just to understand the options. I set my coffee down very carefully on the kitchen table. I said that was thoughtful of them. He said the attorney had mentioned that in some circumstances, if a surviving spouse was not managing assets appropriately, there were mechanisms to ensure family interests were protected. He did not say this as a threat. He said it the way Derek had always said difficult things, as information being shared helpfully, in the tone of a man who had practiced it beforehand. I told him I understood and that I would be in touch. I sat at the table for a long time after we hung up. I looked at the oak tree. I thought about 41 years of driving home with grease under my fingernails to a house where someone had already turned the porch light on. I thought about the way Carol used to reach over in the middle of the night and put her hand on my arm for no reason except that she was there and I was there. I thought about a property on a high meadow road in the Blue Ridge Mountains where the view went out for 50 miles on a clear day and a garden that was going to need work in the spring. I called Rebecca. I did not tell her everything that night. I told her I had been doing some thinking and that I might be making some changes after the first of the year, and that I wanted her to come down to Gallatin sometime in December if she could manage it. She said she could manage it. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was better than I'd been in a few weeks, which was true. I spent December doing things quietly. I called Gerald Holt up in Valley Crucis, and we talked for 40 minutes about the property, the neighbors, the condition of the house, what the winters were like, whether I could get reliable internet up there. I hired a contractor Gerald recommended to go through the house and make sure everything was sound. The report came back with a short list of small repairs, nothing serious. I arranged to have them done. I went through 40 years of accumulated things in the Gallatin house carefully and without rushing. I kept what I wanted. I donated what someone else could use. I put some things in boxes and labeled them with Derek's name, things that had been his as a boy. His mother's things that she would have wanted him to have. Things I felt he had a legitimate connection to. I stacked those boxes in the second bedroom. Rebecca came down the second weekend of December. We sat in the kitchen and I told her everything. Carol's letter, the trust, the property in North Carolina, the conversation with Robert Whitfield, Derek's phone calls, the attorney comment. I told it all in order and without editorializing, the way Carol had always told things, the way she'd taught me to by example over 40 years. Rebecca was quiet through most of it. When I finished, she looked at the table for a while. She planned all of this, she said. I said she had. For you, she said. I said yes. Rebecca looked up at me with the expression of a woman processing more than one thing at once. What do you need from me? She asked. I told her what I needed. She said yes before I finished the sentence. In the second week of January, Robert Whitfield transferred the Gallatin house title to Derek as an outright gift, which I had the right to do as the sole surviving owner. There was no debt on the house. There were no conditions. I included a letter, 1 page, that explained the boxes in the second bedroom and which of Carol's things were in which box, and that asked Derek to maintain the garden along the back fence if he could, because the zinnias came back on their own every year and didn't need much. I also informed him in the letter that I had been managing my affairs appropriately, that no legal intervention was necessary or would be successful, and that I wished him and Shannon well. I did not send that letter with drama. I had Robert Whitfield's office handle it while I was already on the road. The drive from Gallatin to Valley Crucis takes about 4.5 hours if you go through Cookville and pick up the interstate near Cookville, which I did because I stopped at Rebecca's house for coffee and to say goodbye to her in person. She walked me out to my truck in the cold morning and held my arm for a moment and said, "She knew exactly what she was doing." I told her I was aware of that. "She knew you'd need a place to go," Rebecca said. "She knew you'd need something she had already made safe." I drove east on I-40 with the truck full and the winter morning opening up ahead of me. The sky going from gray to a thin, pale blue the way it does in January when the cold is dry and the air is clear, and I thought about Carol at the kitchen sink handing me a dish to dry and saying she's been calculating, and I thought about October sunlight through bedroom curtains, and I thought about how a person who loves you does not always tell you everything they are doing for you, sometimes because the doing itself is the point. The road into Watauga County climbs. You come through Boone, and then you follow smaller roads up through the folds of the mountains, and by the time you reach Valley Crucis, the sky has opened up above the ridgelines and the light is coming in at angles you don't get in the valley. It was mid-afternoon when I turned onto the meadow road, and the mountains were carrying the last of the winter light on their western faces, and I sat in the truck for a minute in front of the house before I went in. It was smaller than our Gallatin house. 3 rooms and a good kitchen, and a porch that ran the full length of the south side, facing the mountains. The contractor had done solid work. Everything was sound. There was firewood stacked under the porch overhang, which Gerald Holt had arranged because that was the kind of neighbor he was. I brought my things in, and I built a fire in the wood stove, and I made coffee, and I stood on the south porch in my coat while the last light went off the mountains. The cold was clean and still. From the meadow below the house, I could hear a creek running, thin and steady over the winter stones. Gerald came over that evening. A tall man in his 70s with the easy manner of someone who has lived a long time in a place he chose. His wife Margaret came with him. They brought a pot of soup, which I hadn't thought to plan for, and we sat at the kitchen table, and they told me about the valley, and I told them about Carol in the straightforward way I had been learning to talk about her, and they listened the way people listen when they have lost people themselves and understand that listening is the whole thing. Before they left, Gerald said, "Your wife was a good one. She kept up with this property like she intended to live in it herself someday." I thought about that after he left. I sat by the wood stove with the fire going, and the creek outside, and the mountains beyond the meadow. And I thought about Carol buying this place through a quiet, separate account, driving up here to check on it over 12 years, without ever making it into something she needed to explain to me. I thought about her sitting across from Robert Whitfield and saying, "Harold will need somewhere to go. Make sure it's ready." She had not needed me to know ahead of time. She had needed it to be there when I arrived. I had never tried gardening seriously. Carol was right that I hadn't, but she had also been right about a great many other things I had initially resisted, including the truck I was now driving, the doctor I'd been putting off seeing, the way to talk to Derek when he was 15, and convinced he knew everything, with patience and without condescension. A technique I had not always succeeded at but had always tried. I called Rebecca before I went to sleep that first night. She asked how the drive had been. I told her the roads were clear and the house was warm and the mountains were exactly what she would expect mountains to be. She laughed and said she'd come visit in the spring. I told her to come hungry because I was planning to grow tomatoes. She asked if I meant that. I said Carol thought I had the patience for it. She was usually right, Rebecca said. I agreed that she was. I slept better that night than I had in 4 months. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. The creek ran outside. The mountains held the dark in a way that flat country never manages. A deeper dark, a quiet that has weight and texture. And I lay in the bed that Carol had never slept in but had nonetheless made ready for me, and I thought about a woman who had spent 41 years making sure I had what I needed. Not always in the ways I'd expected, not always with explanation, but consistently and without fail, right up to the last thing she ever did for me. Derek called 3 days later. I let it ring. He called again that evening. I let it ring again. He left a voicemail that I listened to once and then deleted. His tone was the tone of a man who has just discovered that a door he thought he was about to walk through was never going to open for him, and is still deciding whether to be angry or to pretend he is not surprised. There was nothing for him to contest. The Gallatin house was his, free and clear. A gift of significant value from a father who owed him nothing of the kind. The trust was Robert Whitfield's to administer, and had been established legally and properly. I had not hidden anything. I had simply not discussed it. Carol had understood something about our son that I had been slow to accept, and she had built around it the way a good carpenter builds around a flaw in the wood, not by pretending it isn't there, but by making sure it can't compromise the structure. I called Derek back on Sunday. I told him I was settled, that I was doing well, that the transfer of the Gallatin property would be finalized in the coming weeks, and the house was in excellent condition. I told him the zinnia seeds would self-propagate if he left the dead stalks over the winter and cleared them in the spring before the new growth came up, and that if Shannon didn't want a garden, she could pull everything, and the ground would take grass again in one season without much effort. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked where I was. I told him I was in the mountains. He asked what I meant. I told him his mother had always loved the mountains. He didn't have anything to say to that. We said goodbye politely, the way people say goodbye when there is more to say and both of them know it and neither of them is going to say it now. In February, a neighbor down the meadow road named Catherine started stopping by. She was in her late 60s, a retired nurse from Charlotte, had a small farm with goats she kept mainly for company. She brought eggs sometimes. We started having coffee on my south porch on Tuesday mornings when the weather was decent, looking out at the mountains, talking about what the valley had been like before, what the winters ran, what grew well at this elevation. She had known Gerald and Margaret for years. She had not known Carol, but when I described Carol, she said she sounded like a woman who got things done. I said that was a fair description. The good ones always do, Catherine said. She looked out at the mountains with her coffee cup in both hands. They're always 5 steps ahead of us, and gracious enough not to say so. I said Carol had occasionally said so. Catherine laughed. It was a good laugh, easy and without performance. Well, she said, at least she knew you could take it. I ordered seeds in late February. I had looked up what grew well in western North Carolina at this elevation, in this soil type. With the amount of frost we got in late spring, and I had made a list in the systematic way I have always approached new things carefully, with research, without rushing. I ordered tomatoes, bell peppers, and a flat of zinnia seeds, the orange and yellow variety, because those were the ones Carol had always preferred. The ground would be ready to work by April. There is a particular quality to the light in the Blue Ridge Mountains on a clear morning in late winter, when the temperature is still sharp, but the angle of the sun has shifted just enough that you can feel the year beginning to turn. I had not known that before. There were many things about this particular stretch of country I was still learning, which roads turned to mud in a hard rain, where the good hardware store was, what the summers were like, who the reliable people were, how the sound of the creek changed in the spring when the snowmelt came down from the high ridges. I was not in a hurry to learn all of it at once. I had time. One evening, in early March, I was sitting on the south porch after dinner, the temperature just cool enough for a coat, watching the last color go out of the western sky. The mountains went from green to blue to a soft gray, one after another. The way colors leave things slowly and without announcing themselves. I had a glass of bourbon. I had the porch to myself. I had Gerald and Margaret a quarter-mile down the road and Catherine a half-mile further and Robert Whitfield in Gallatin who knew how to reach me and Rebecca who was coming in April with her husband and their 2 girls who had never seen mountains. I thought about my son and the legal pad and the real estate website and all the careful calculations he had done at my kitchen table in the weeks after his mother's funeral, and I did not feel what I might have expected to feel about it. I had felt that already. Back in November, in the kitchen, looking at the oak tree. What I felt now was something quieter and less urgent. More like the feeling you have when something that took a long time to understand has finally settled into place. Carol had understood it years before I had. She had made her preparations and said nothing, and handed me a cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen sink talking about other things. And she had been right about all of it, the property, the trust, Rebecca, the garden, the fact that I had the patience for growing things if I would only try. The sky was nearly dark. The creek moved below the meadow, speaking in its thin winter voice over the stones. I had a lot to learn about gardening. I thought that was fine. The spring was coming, and the seeds were ordered, and the ground was going to be ready, and Carol had left very clear instructions. I intended to follow them.